Of course, John spends a lot of time at the end, but also when we start talking about the week of what we would consider maybe the trip to the cross, there's a lot John doesn't give us that the Synoptic Gospels do. So, and then we kind of have to kind of balance that. Why John didn't include some things that Matthew, Mark, and Luke did, and vice versa. John doesn't spend a lot of time in the garden, as we get in the Gospels with the prayer and the disciples falling asleep and all that in the garden. John doesn't spend a lot of time there. But you got to remember, John's Gospel's late. The other Gospels were written by the time John wrote his Gospel, so a lot of that information was there, right? So I don't know that John felt the need to reiterate a lot of that stuff. But what John does really focus on is really his conversation with Pilate, which a lot we get in John, we don't get in the Synoptics. Jesus' conversation where Pilate says, are you a king? And Jesus says, did somebody tell you that, or did you come to that on your own? We don't get that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So that little bit of information John throws in there. We all kind of know the story of the cross, the story to the cross. Pilate and his decision, or his wanting not to crucify Jesus, and yet the Jews insisting upon that. The offering of Barabbas as a substitute, and the Jews' refusal to accept Jesus, to say Barabbas should be freed and not Jesus. It's something that I think as Christians we look at this often, and maybe the cruelty of it. It's a very cruel world that Jesus lived in, though, and the truth is that scourgings, crucifixions, this type of thing weren't really uncommon. It was something that was part of their world. It was part of the world they lived in. But it doesn't make it any less cruel, doesn't make it any less barbaric. It's just was a fact of the time. Jesus came at a time when crucifixion was the capital punishment for those that weren't Romans. Jesus wasn't a Roman citizen, so therefore he would go to the cross. The things that happened before the crucifixion, the scourging, the crown of thorns, the slapping, the placing the robe upon him, a lot of that, of course, was unique, I'm sure, to Christ. I'm sure nobody else probably ever really went through that but Jesus. And a lot of that shame and humiliation is probably a lot of maybe the worst part of Jesus going to the cross. The idea of those who betrayed him, and not necessarily so much in the betrayal, but those who betrayed him in the sense that they turned away from him in his time of need. The people that he came to save, right? The Jews. He came to save the Jews. That's what he came to do. And it's those who turned against him in the end, in the last hour. To me, the most difficult part of the journey to the cross has always been the people that Jesus saw along the way, I would think. Those that he said, I fed you, I healed you, I took care of, did things for you, and yet here you are. You're scorning me. You're sending me to the cross. You're sending me to my death. That humiliation had to just be heartbreaking to Christ. To hear them in the street calling, crucify him, crucify him. The idea that he must die because he made himself out to be the Son of God. Pilate was afraid of that statement, didn't it? Because they were very polytheistic. The idea of gods was really real to them, and they didn't deny God. They didn't deny the God of the Jews. They didn't necessarily accept that he was the only God, the one and only God, but they never denied that. If you look at Paul's little discourse on Mars Hill in Acts, where he goes and he sees all the deals to the gods, there's one to the unknown God, right? They weren't against there being another God. That was okay. Build another temple, have another God. What they were opposed to was saying there was only one God, that your gods were no longer valid. So Pilate was scared. He was fearful because he said he was the Son of God, right? And that was a fearful statement for Pilate. It scared him even more, right? He entered the praetorium. Where are you from? No answer. Why did he ask that question? Where are you from? Did he not know he was a Galilean, do you think? What did he mean by that? Where are you really from, maybe? What do you think he would ask that? Was it significant? What part of the world Jesus was born in? Who he was? Where he's really from, right? Where are you really from, right? Who are you really? Well, that's a great question, isn't it? Jesus avoided that question almost all of his earthly ministry, didn't he? Where are you really from? Who are you really? Right? Well, I'm from Galilee, right? From Nazareth, from a humble beginning. I don't think that's really what Pilate wanted to know. If you're the Son of God, then where are you really from? You know, in Greek mythology and Roman mythology, how did that happen, right? You all have probably looked at that. You know, we've all heard the story of Hercules, right? Where did Hercules come from in mythology? Who was Hercules' father in mythology? Zeus, right? And Zeus came to earth, and he had relations with a woman, and the product of that was this, what in mythology we would call a demigod, right? A demigod. In other words, he was the son of Zeus, and he was the son of a woman, and so he was half God. And in mythology, there's a lot of half gods, what we call demigods. Really a big thing in mythology. You know, we don't think of that this way, do we? Because we're not people who think about Roman mythology or Greek mythology or the world that Jesus lived in. But really to understand how Pilate thought of Jesus, we kind of have to think how they thought, not how we think. So when Pilate says, "Where are you from?" that's a real valid question to him, right? In other words, if you're the Son of God, now to Pilate, he wouldn't have heard that. He would have heard, "You're the son of a God." There's a big difference in that statement, isn't there? If whether you're the son of God or the son of a God, there's a really big difference in that. But in their mind, there were all kinds of gods, and there were all kinds of demigods. And so when he says, "Where are you from?" he wasn't really thinking of that maybe the same way you and I would think of that. And that would be difficult to answer, even for Jesus, wouldn't it? Well, he was the Son of God, right? Of God, not a God. He was the Son of God. His Father was God. But he was born of a woman. That kind of sounds like what a demigod is to a Roman or a Greek, doesn't it? A little bit. So this isn't unfamiliar to them. This is part of their belief. Interesting when you think of it that way. Of course, we understand that he's the Son of God. But now let's think of how Pilate thinks for a minute. So in this mythology, Greek and Roman mythology, when these demigods were born, supposedly, these sons of a god, of whatever god, and man, they seemed to have power, didn't they? Hercules was strong, right? Or maybe they were fast, right? They seemed to have power. So if we're Pilate to think you're the Son of God, son of a God, well, you would have power. Did Jesus have power? Absolutely, right? You know, and Jesus kind of exerts that a little bit, doesn't he? Pilate says, "Do not speak to me. Do you not know I have authority to do it?" What did Jesus say? He says, "You have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above, unless it's been given you from my Father." Right? In other words, I have the power here. You don't have the power here. You think you have the power here, but you really don't have the power here. I have the power here. You know, you think you're in control, but you're only in control because I'm letting you be in control. And it's kind of an interesting play. And sometimes we don't think about it that way because you and I don't think the way that Pilate thought. We don't have his same theology, his same religion. We don't live in that world. In a Roman world where even in Judea, in a world of Rome where there's temples on every corner. You know, the amazing thing about Judaism at that time was the fact they believed there's only one God. Only one. And here Jesus says, "I'm the Son of that God. Because I'm the Son of that God, I got power. And you only have authority because I give you the authority." You see why Pilate was a little bit scared? You see? Wouldn't you be? I'd be a little scared. And so Pilate was kind of scared. He was a little bit frightened. But Jesus kind of lets him off the hook in 11. Because in 11, Jesus says, Well, they had the greater sin. He kind of lets Pilate off the hook a little, doesn't he? A little bit. He says, well, listen, he says, the one who delivered me to you is the one who has the greater sin, not you. Kind of interesting how Jesus kind of lets him off the hook a little. And sometimes we think, well, why did Jesus do that? Why did he pin it upon the Jew? Why did he pin it upon those who handed it over? Because Jesus wasn't sent to Pilate. Jesus was sent to the Jews. Right? They're the ones who betrayed him. They're the ones who cast him out. He said they had the greater sin. Pilate wanted to release him. You kind of understand where Pilate's at maybe a little better now. A little fearful. Right? I need to let this guy go. Not that he's guilty or innocent or whatever. Pilate probably could have, for most people, could probably have cared less. But all of a sudden he's like, I need to let this guy go. Yeah. Well, because it's sin. I mean, that's a really valid question, yeah. Right, they should have known who he was, what he was there to do, and yet they didn't. He said they had the greater sin because they were the ones who were going to be held accountable for that, or what they did, yeah. Yeah, it was a crowd mentality. It was a riot mentality. A lot of those people did know, and a lot of those people probably believed, but they weren't going to stand up against this crowd, against this riot. I think sin, the greater sin, there's a lot of ways to look at that statement, but for one thing is Pilate was a Gentile. Pilate wasn't a Jew. Pilate was never saved. Really, sin didn't mean anything to Pilate anyway, but to the Jew it did mean something to them. It was about their righteousness, about who they were. If you're not a Christian, sin means something because it's gonna condemn you. But the truth is that if you're in sin anyway, another sin is not gonna make you more condemned. For a Christian, sin carries weight. Yeah, right. They're the ones who did it. Yeah, you do what you got to do. The Jews, of course, wouldn't do it, accused him of not being a friend of Caesar. He brought Jesus out. He set him down on the pavement. Preparation of the Passover, 6th hour. Behold your king, right? So what time of day are we? 6th hour is when? Noon. Right? 3rd, 6th, and 9th to a Jew. 3rd, 6th, and 9th. 3rd would be 9, 6th would be noon, 9th would be 3. So this is noon. So we're noon on the day that Jesus is going to be crucified. So they cried out, away with him, away with him. So all this happened before noon, basically. Right? They went and got him that night. They brought him to Annas, right, first. Brought him to Caiaphas, Annas, brought him to Pilate, brought him to Herod, Pilate. So all this stuff took place within the course of just a few hours. So they started really early, before daylight. So basically Jesus at this particular point hasn't had any sleep in at least, right, a day or two. And John doesn't go into the journey to the cross. He really doesn't go into that. The Gospels do, about Jesus going up the journey, calling Joseph of Arimathea to carry the cross of Jesus. The women on the way, all those other things that went on. They don't really get that. We don't get that in John. John doesn't spend time there because, like I said, I believe that's already been written. It's already been done. They took him. It says he went out bearing his own cross in 17. Of course, we know from the Gospels that Joseph of Arimathea carried his cross eventually at some point up to where he was going to be crucified. And they put two men on either side, Jesus in between. But John tells us a lot about this inscription, more than we get in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. What Pilate put above the head of Jesus on the cross, this sign. And that was common. That was done at crucifixions. You put the charge, you put who they were, the charge above them when they were crucified. So that was a common thing to do. Now, I don't know that it was common to be written in 3 languages, but in this case, Pilate wrote it. He said, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. And it was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. And there's a lot of speculation about that. Hebrew is the temple, language of the temple. Latin is the language of law, and Greek was the language of the people. And maybe there's some truth to that. I think Aramaic was more the language of the people, but Greek was spoken. They didn't want to write it. Don't write King of the Jews, but I am the King of the Jews. And of course, Pilate refused. He says, I have written what I have written. And when they crucified Jesus, they took his outer garments and made 4 parts. I think it's interesting here. Where's my Bible? I really like this. If you really look at this, like this journey right here and what's going on and these things that are going on, and most of the stuff's prophesied. But if you look at the 22nd Psalm, which really is played out here, and you kind of get an idea of why this is important. I think everything is important, of course, at the cross, but there was a lot of things here that were fulfilled. The 22nd Psalm starts with the words Jesus would utter from the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? You know, even the words Jesus spoke from the cross were prophecy. It wasn't necessarily his words, essentially. But he said this, I think, to bring Jews to remembrance of these passages. But in the 22nd, okay, my Bible turned pages. But in the 22nd Psalm, if we read down through this, you'll see in here that it says, let's go down to 11. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help. Many bulls have surrounded me, strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me. They open wide their mouth at me as a ravening and a roaring lion. I am poured out like water. All of my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax that is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaves to my jaws. And you lay me in the dust of death. For dogs have surrounded me. A band of evildoers has encompassed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They look, they stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. You know, all this stuff that's happening is prophesied to happen. There's no accidents here. There's no ad lib here. This is planned. And when you really look at that, it's just amazing how it all plays out. The idea of even the casting of the lots. It's an interesting, very interesting thought here that these things are all laid out in advance. They took his outer garments and made 4 parts, a part for every soldier and also the tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece. So that's the outer garments. So it's woven in one piece. So if you're familiar with how that works when people weave, it's really a tedious process to weave a garment all in one piece. No seams, right? Can you imagine having a coat with no seams, shirt with no seams, right? So it's valuable. And as far as we know, that's the only thing of value that Jesus possessed was his outer garment. As far as we know, he didn't own anything. He owned no property. Matter of fact, he said, You know, when he wanted to follow him, he says the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. As far as we know, he had no property, he had no house, he had no wealth. This was the one thing he had that had value. And the outer garment in that time was important. As a matter of fact, you weren't allowed, in Jewish law, you weren't allowed to take somebody's outer garment. Even if they owed you a debt, you weren't allowed to take it, because their outer garment is what they slept on, it's what they covered themselves, what protected from the elements. You weren't allowed to take it. That's one thing you couldn't take from them, was the outer garment. So it was kind of a sacred thing in a way. And so this garment had value. And if you look at the Psalms 22nd, it says, for my garments, they cast lots, which is exactly what they do here. So they didn't tear it. It says, let us not tear it, but cast lots. And this is fulfilled the scripture, which I just read you in the 22nd Psalm. They divided my outer garments, and for my clothing they cast lots. It's pretty astounding when you think of it. They divided my outer garments, which is what they did, and for my clothing they cast lots. Right out of the 22nd Psalm. Things here are not accidental. In Luke tells in Acts, he says that Jesus was handed over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God. In other words, there was no accident here. He did exactly what he was supposed to do, exactly when he was supposed to do it, exactly how he was supposed to do it. And so it's kind of fascinating when we look at the cross that way. Therefore the soldiers did these things, but standing by the cross were his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. And when Jesus saw his mother, the disciple whom he loved, and that's the way it's always referred to in John. Like I say, John never says his name in this gospel. We always give it to John, but he always just refers himself as a disciple whom Jesus loved. So we may make that assumption as John. And historically, this plays out, okay? Because Jesus, at this point, he said, Jesus saw his mother. He says, one, behold your son, and behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own household. Now, there's some historical background to this, because John, as you know the story of John, Nero will try to kill him and is unsuccessful. According to tradition, Nero boiled him in oil and he didn't die. Now that's just tradition, okay? But because of that, Nero said, I can't kill him, so I'm going to banish him. So Nero sent him to Patmos. Now Patmos is where John wrote Revelation. But Nero, of course, is not going to stay in power. And when John is released from Patmos, John goes to Ephesus. And we know historically that John will spend the remainder of his life in Ephesus up until the time he dies, which John maybe was close to 100 years old before he died. That's what a lot of people think. So John would stay there in Ephesus. But John, historically and traditionally, John took Mary with him to Ephesus, and he put her in a house in Ephesus, and that's where she remained, outside of Ephesus. And when we went to Turkey, we got to go to the supposedly, now I'm going to say supposedly because I don't know, but that's what they say, supposedly the house of Mary, which was up on this hill outside of Ephesus that somehow had survived the earthquakes, because Ephesus was obviously destroyed, but it had survived, and that was the house of Mary. And traditionally, that's what is said, and historically, is that John lived his life in Ephesus, that he put a house for Mary, and that he took care of Mary until he died. So that gives us some credibility to this being John, historical credibility to this being John, the disciple who Jesus loved being John. It gives us some historical credibility. So that apparently is what transpired, what took place. Kind of interesting. So he took this to heart. Now, why do you think Jesus didn't leave his mother to one of his brothers to take care of? Jesus had brothers, right? He had Judas, he had James, he had brothers. Why didn't he leave his mother to a brother, one of his brothers? Why wouldn't it be their responsibility to take care of their mother? Maybe he knew John would outlive her. But I think it's more than that. You know, when Jesus was teaching, remember, and his mother and his brothers came, and they said, your mothers and brothers are outside. And Jesus says, these are my mothers, and these are my brother and my mothers and my sister, those who do the will of the Father. At the time that Jesus was crucified, did his brothers believe that he was the Christ? They didn't, right? We know that from the scripture. They did not believe that he was the Christ until after the resurrection, right? And he appeared to James, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, he appeared to James his brother, right? And they became, James and Jude, they became Christians or became followers of Jesus. But that didn't happen until after the resurrection. And so I think when Jesus left his mother to John, it was because John was his spiritual family. John was more of his brother than his brothers. And so that's really an interesting statement. We talked about that old saying, right, that we always use that says blood is thicker than water. Heard that my whole life, right? And I always thought that to mean my whole life, that it meant being a biological sibling or would be thicker than that. But of course, we know that's not what that means, right? The real meaning of that statement is blood, in other words, Christ's blood, us being brothers and sisters, is thicker than water, which would be biological birth. That's what that really means. So when I say blood is thicker than water, it really means my Christian family, my brothers and sisters in Christ are more my family than those who are born to me. So we really look at that statement, and I always thought that was fascinating because my whole life I looked at that as being family, blood related is thicker than water, but really that's not what it means. And I think Jesus really thought that. You know, he's really my brother. He's the one that needs to take care of my mother. And so there's a lot of power because she had sons. But yet here, Jesus, being the eldest, right? And in that society, the eldest son, that carries a lot of weight. Jesus being the eldest, he gave the care of his mother unto John. I always thought that was really, really fascinating. Yeah. Right. So it's just kind of strange. Well, like. We don't know really that she didn't go to her sons for periods of time. Right. Yeah, we don't know that. But like Buck says, maybe Jesus knew that John was going to outlive all of them. So, you know, so maybe that was the best play, you know. Married at this time? Do I now? Was John married? Don't know the answer to that question. Yeah, I don't know that John was married. I know Peter was married, but you know, we really don't know. You know, of course, Paul says, you know, they're allowed to bring along their wives, which gives you an idea. Several of them were married, but we don't know if all of them were married or not. We don't have that information. If John wasn't married, it would be reasonable to understand that, you know, there would be no conflict in that household of bringing in another woman. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. We assume by this time Joseph is dead, and that's one reason we think that, because obviously he wanted to put her into someone's care. So it's legitimate to assume that. Joseph was probably older than Mary, probably maybe substantially older than Mary. So Mary was probably just a teenage girl whenever she conceived, and there's a really good chance Joseph was substantially older in that society than she was. So that's totally understandable that Joseph is dead. So we kind of read some stuff into this that way. After this, Jesus, knowing all things that already been accomplished. You know, one thing he said about is John married, is John not married? But an interesting thing here, it says he took her into his household. And that's something you got to think about, because in that society, household meant there was some sort of relation there, you know. In other words, it wasn't just talking about a physical house. It was talking about people. So, I don't know. Some things we just don't know. You know, we just got to leave it at that. So, but there's things we kind of read into things. A jar full of sour wine was standing there. They put a sponge full of sour wine, brought it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." He bowed his head and gave up the spirit. So we don't get maybe as big a picture at the cross as we do in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but John brings up some things we don't get there, some ideas of what went on. So it was noon when he left Pilate's hall, right? And now before dark, he's already died. Generally, people lasted a while on the cross. That was one reason they used it, because it took a while to die, bad as that seems. That's how come if you were not a Roman, you went to the cross. But if you were a Roman, you got your head chopped off. Because if you had your choice, the head deal probably a better deal than hanging on a cross. So if there is a good way to die, I don't know if there's a good way to die, but it would be better than the other, right? And that's one reason when Paul and Peter were both killed by Nero, Peter was crucified, Paul was beheaded. Paul was a Roman citizen. So it kind of plays out. In this scenario, Jesus gave up the Spirit before dark on that night, because we know that because they wanted him off of the cross. They wanted him off of the cross before nightfall because of the Sabbath, because that, now this of course is where, I don't agree with the Catholic timeline, and I didn't bring that up, but this is the high Sabbath. John tells us that. High Sabbath. So that's how come I don't think this was Saturday, as the world thinks, or as the Catholics have tried to make us believe for our entire lives, that it was Friday that Jesus was tried, and Saturday was Sabbath. I think this was the Sabbath because this was Passover Sabbath, because Passover didn't always fall on a Saturday. This year, Passover did not fall on a Saturday. So I think that this was not that. I think this was Wednesday night. I think high Sabbath would have been on Thursday, which would have been Passover. They pierced his side with a spear. Water and blood came out, making certain that he was dead. They wanted the legs broke on the others, because to my understanding, when you break someone's legs on the cross, they can't breathe, and they asphyxiate, because they can no longer lift themselves up to breathe. So it hastens the death. But part of the prophecy was not one of his bones would be broken, right? Not a bone would be broken. So they didn't break his legs because he was already dead. And they wanted him off the cross before night. John says, he who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true. He knows that he is telling the truth, so you also may believe. These things came to pass to fulfill the scripture, not a bone of him shall be broken. Another scripture says, they shall look on him whom they pierced. After these things, Joseph of Arimathea. I think this is one part of this story that we go over way too fast. We're bringing in two men. John brings in two men. And I think these men are significant. It's Joseph of Arimathea, and the other one that he brings in here is going to be Nicodemus. So there's two men here that are really, really prevalent in this part of the story. And they're wealthy men. A lot of times we talk about wealth, and that Jesus always spoke against wealth, and that maybe to be wealthy was a sin. But these two men, who were both disciples of Jesus, who were both wealthy men, who both had something to lose. And I think Joseph of Arimathea, that's not a guy that we hear much about in the Bible. But boy, there is such a great story about him traditionally. Now, whether or not it's true, I can't answer that question. But there's such a wonderful story about Joseph of Arimathea. Tradition, right? I did say that. Everybody got that, right? Tradition. And the story of Joseph of Arimathea is really quite interesting, because traditionally, Joseph of Arimathea, he's a wealthy man. It was prophesied, if you read the 53rd Psalm, which we call the suffering servant passage of the Bible, in the 53rd Psalm, or the Isaiah 53, not 53 Psalm, Isaiah 53, right? In Isaiah 53, the prophet Isaiah said, he'll be laid with the rich in his death, right? He'll be numbered with the transgressors. Isaiah 53 says he'll be numbered with the transgressors, which is true, right? He was hung between two thieves, numbered with the transgressors. But it says he'll be with the rich in his death. I think this is the fulfillment of Isaiah 53. He was laid with the rich in his death. Okay, now So, okay, so this is why I say that. So in that country, rocky. Judea is really rocky, okay? That's how come it lasted as long as it did, because nothing grows there. Right? Nobody wanted it, you know? So when Israel got carried off, they're like, oh, who wants Judea? I mean, you know, it's a rocky piece of ground. Nobody wants it, right? That's one reason Judea kind of lasted. And so it's really rocky. And so what they did for tombs here is they would hew them out of rock. They would hew out a hole in a rock. Well, there's two things about that. One is it's expensive because you got to pay somebody to chisel a hole in a rock, which ain't cheap, right? Because they didn't have jackhammers in those days. It was a hammer and a piece of steel. And the other thing is that it was limited room. Judea is not very big. I mean, if you look at the war going on over there right now and Google that part of the world and that area, you'll understand how really small that is. I mean, literally, they're fighting for a piece of ground that's here to Okmulgee. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? It's small. And so what they would do is they would use these tombs over and over and over. If you had a tomb, it's kind of a family tomb. And when somebody died, you would just push grandpa to the back and slide in grandma, you know. You didn't, because it was expensive. But this tomb, according to Scripture, right, where no one had ever been laid. So Joseph of Arimathea is a wealthy guy. He's built this tomb for him, and nobody's ever been in it. He's wealthy. He was with the rich in his death. But traditionally, it says that Joseph of Arimathea, now I'm just going to give you this. I think it's interesting. We're about out of time, so I'm going to stop here. But I think it's interesting tradition. Traditionally, it says that after the resurrection, Jesus appeared to Joseph of Arimathea, and that Joseph of Arimathea became kind of intimately acquainted with Jesus after the crucifixion, during the resurrection, and that Joseph of Arimathea became one of the greatest disciples of Jesus Christ because of that interaction. But it's interesting because in tradition, it says that Joseph of Arimathea is one of the people that Jesus appeared to several times after the resurrection. And I think that's kind of fascinating because we don't hear much about him, and we don't think much about him. But he really stuck his neck out here, didn't he? I mean, he really stuck his neck out by giving Jesus to him, by taking the body down, by seeing that it was prepared, by doing the things that he did. He really stuck his neck out. And so Joseph of Arimathea is not a guy we think a lot about or talk a lot about, but he really stepped up and did something here that was really, really important in this whole scenario. Fulfillment of prophecy. He kind of stood against those people that he knew. He stood up for Jesus. He was obviously a follower of Jesus, a believer of Jesus before this ever happened. And then we have to think about Nicodemus, how he played out in this, that came to Jesus by night in John chapter 3. We'll talk about that next Sunday morning. But I just think we really skip over these two guys, and I really think they're instrumental in this story. They're really a big part of this story. And sometimes I think we just kind of read over it and don't think much about it, but they were important in this. And they had value in this, and it's really John who really talks about them here. These two guys, these two Jews, Joseph, Arimathea, and Nicodemus. And we need to talk about Nicodemus a little bit. Thanks for your time this morning.